Hi, this is Literacy Ready, History Unit 2, Lesson 4, Annotating a Chapter, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what students are going to do in this lesson is they're going to read a portion of the history chapter to learn more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they're going to take notes on the chapter in annotation. And after they have done that, they're going to integrate the information in the chapter with the notes that they took in the previous lesson, Lesson 3. Finally, they're going to characterize the Cuban Missile Crisis as cause and effects using a tool called the History Pattern Organizer. It's important for students to get practice in reading and annotating history chapters because although they might not have had to do this very often in their high school classes, they surely will in their college level classes. So if they don't have this practice, they need to get that practice. It's also a good way to build context and for the further reading that they're going to do with documents and secondary sources. One of the things that you're asking them to do when they read a chapter is consider the authors of that chapter and their potential for being biased, because historians will tell you that everything that is written about history is open to question, and you always have to take into account the bias of those things, even if it's a history text chapter. So they're going to preview the chapter, and they're going to consider who the authors were and what kind of stance they might be taking as they wrote this chapter. So the chapter is written by Tyndall and Shai, and they may see that Tyndall and Shai include both civil rights movement and U.S. foreign affairs movement in the same chapter as a result of their preview. So you want to ask the question, why? Why would they do those two things? One of the things that historians like to know is kind of what the range of topics is that is going to be covered in a particular chapter, and what were the reasons for choosing certain things and leaving other things out. So that's what you're going to be trying to get at by asking them to look at the range of information. They might also note the shortness of the sections. These are not very long sections. They're pretty incomplete. And so later they're going to find that there is a lot more information about the Cuban Missile Crisis than is represented in this textbook. The textbook is giving the bare bones of the event, but it's not giving you all of those juicy details that you're going to be reading about. So in this lesson, they are going to use a strategy called G-Sprite while they're reading. They're going to pay attention to historically relevant information, which is on page 50 and 51 of the teacher's guide, and represents information that they've already learned before. They're going to discuss the analysis of a paragraph. They're going to analyze a text excerpt, and they're going to read and annotate the Tyndall and Shai excerpt. So first, in terms of the G-Sprite, what that is the letters in that name, G-Sprite, stand for those societal functions that historians pay attention to when they're trying to categorize activities or causes and effect or motivations. So the G stands for geographical, the S stands for social, the P stands for political, the R stands for religious, the I stands for intellectual, the T stands for technological, and the E stands for economic. So what you're going to be doing as they go through this is you're going to have students, when they are actually reading the excerpt of the Tyndall and Shai chapter, to try to pay attention to what might be political and what might be social and what might be intellectual and what might be geographical in the information that they are reading. They're also going to be paying attention to those things you pay attention to when you're reading or learning about history, and that is the relationships among events, who the actors are, what kind of actions they engaged in, Maybe some of the characteristics of actors, actions, policies, movements, etc. And that would be, maybe it's political, maybe it's geographic. You're thinking about motivations. Why did people do certain things? And you're comparing and contrasting different interpretations of cause, effect, motivation, characteristics. You're thinking about what Tyndall and Shai are writing as being claims. These are claims the authors are making about what happened and what was significant. And students, when they read, are going to be thinking about what they're saying as being claims and backed up by evidence, which may or may not be visible. And they're also going to be paying attention to vocabulary, words that signal intentions of the author or bias, words that describe key concepts, and words that signal relationships among events are all important words that they should pay attention to when they read. Now, if students have not completed Unit 1, this part of the lesson is going to be critical, where they're learning to read and analyze written history. You're going to have to model the kind of interpretation. So, especially as they learn to annotate. If they have not had practice in annotating before, this is a kind of a hard skill to get their minds around. And you're going to have to model it, they're going to have some practice, and you're going to have to give them feedback as a whole group before they can actually practice on their own or in pairs. So a paragraph is provided for you in the teacher's guide. You're going to share this paragraph and use it for your model. And I would strongly suggest that before you present the lesson, you read that paragraph, think about what the annotations mean, and analyze it before you share your analysis with students. It's really important to kind of rehearse that information so that you'll make sure that you're getting at the points you want students to pick up on. So, if students have not completed Unit 1, this is all going to be rather new to them. And what they're doing in Activities 2 and 3 is they're learning information that will be critical in how they learn to read and analyze written history. So you're going to have to model how you're interpreting history, and a paragraph is provided for you in the teacher's guide. I would read it, know how you will analyze it before you share your analysis with students. And here is the paragraph. It is Khrushchev bullied and browbeat Kennedy and threatened to limit Western access to Berlin, the divided city located 100 miles within communist East Germany. Kennedy, in turn, was stunned by the Soviet leader's aggressive demeanor. Upon his return home, he demonstrated his resolve by calling up Army Reserve and National Guard units. The Soviets responded by erecting the Berlin Wall, isolating West Berlin, and preventing all movements between the two parts of the city. The Berlin Wall plugged the most accessible escape hatch for East Germans, demonstrated the Soviets' willingness to challenge American resolve in Europe, and became another intractable barrier to improved relations between East and West. So you're going to be reading that with students, but you're going to be stopping and talking about what meaning you are making of what you're reading as you go through. So you notice that here the authors are kind of making a cause and effect chain. They're saying, well, Kennedy went to this talk, he was bullied, he came back, he did this because of this, the Soviet Russians did this. So it's a chain of events, one event causing another event. And so you could actually depict this chain on paper or on your board or on your whiteboard, whatever. So on page 62 of the teacher's guide, you're going to see a depiction of this. You can do it this way, or you can find another way to depict this cause and effect relationship. And you also want students to understand that the events that are being talked about in that particular paragraph are chronological in nature, And what the historians are doing is they are inferring what's cause and effect. So cause and effect relations just aren't out there for everybody to see. That's what historians do. They actually figure out in relation and events that are related to each other what that relationship is. And in this case, I think they're inferring that these events were cause and effect. One thing caused the other. In some, it's not all that clear. So did Kennedy, for example, state publicly his motivations for calling up the National Guard? If not, could there be other reasons why he might do it? We don't know if that was particularly the cause of him actually calling up the National Guard, unless there is evidence to support that. And then I want to mention a little bit about G-Sprite, because you can use G-Sprite to interpret that very same paragraph. The events leading to the Berlin Wall, as depicted by Tyndall and Schei, were political in nature, but the effects were geographical, perhaps social as well as political. Another historian might have mentioned the economic effect it had on West Berlin. So all these ways of looking at it through G-Sprite provide you a different lens on the very same paragraph and what it's saying. After you do that, then there are a couple of paragraphs that you can have students work in pairs or small groups to analyze. Then they're going to come back in a whole group and talk about it again. So you're doing the modeling, then you're giving them some guided practice. And those paragraphs are also on page, I'm sorry, I said 62, it's actually 52, on page 52 of the teacher's manual. And some ways to be thinking about those couple of paragraphs as they do it. They'll also be in the student academic notebook. Finally, before you get to them actually reading the document, you're going to go over you're going to go over annotation practices. Again, if they have been through Unit 1, they will have had practice in annotating. If they have not been through Unit 1, then you will need to take some time to teach them to annotate. There is a guide there, and there is also an evaluation, so students can evaluate their own annotations to see how well they did. When they finish annotating, and again I would have students read and annotate in pairs and compare their annotations, be thinking about those things. You want to open up a discussion, and you want this discussion to be open-ended. So once students have read and annotated the section, which is fairly short, you want to engage students in an open-ended discussion. That is, you're going to say, well, what did you notice? What struck you? What do you think is important? What are some of the things that you noted when you were doing your annotation? And before they do this, I must say that I would have students actually reading and annotating in pairs or very small groups, because they can help each other figure out the meaning of the text. Whereas if they're just doing this completely individually, they may not be able to figure out some of the meaning of the particular terms or the kind of descriptions that they're using, and they may not be able to be thinking very critically about it. So engage in this open-ended discussion with them, and when they have exhausted all the possibilities in their discussion, there are some specific questions that are provided in the teacher's guide that you can use to shore up their understandings and help them think a little bit more deeply about the information that was in the chapter. After you do that, they are going to talk through discipline-specific vocabulary, which they already did in the previous lesson and may have done in Unit 1. and they're going to interpret general academic vocabulary. The reason you want it to be open-ended is because students will often surprise you with all of the things that they've noticed as they annotated. This is not a very long excerpt of the chapter to annotate. There's a lot to it. They might have noticed some things that you didn't even think of. So open it up and see what they have to say. For instance, ask questions like, well, what did you notice? What were some of the important things that you would want to remember about the Cuban Missile Crisis based upon what you just read? What do you think the author is telling us about? So just open into discussion until that is actually kind of wind down and there's not too much else that the students can say about it. And then there are some specific questions that you can ask if you think students didn't quite notice all of the things that you would like them to notice about that chapter. So for instance, you'll see those on page 55. There are 9 questions, and the questions range from the kinds of claims that Tyndall and Shai were making, the evidence they used to back up the claims, what kinds of cause-effect claims were they making, what language did they use to signal their position about the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis, and giving you some examples on how to frame that. How Tyndall and Shai portray the motivations of the Soviets, if they have sufficient evidence or not, what categories of historical information, that is a G-sprite, did they identify. Now I would preview those questions so you know what they are. Go to them and any other questions you have if you need them after students have had the open-ended discussion. And in a final activity, they're going to be looking at general academic vocabulary in sentences and discipline-specific vocabulary. They're going to talk through that discipline-specific vocabulary, just as they learned to do in the previous lesson and in Unit 1. But I want to say something about general academic vocabulary. There are some sentences that have those words in them. They are on page 56 of the teacher's guide. For instance, one possible word is volatile, and the sentence there is the volatile Khrushchev bullied and browbeat Kennedy. So you might ask students to, first of all, I would ask students if there were words that they couldn't figure out. Knowing that you've already taught students how to go through and figure out vocabulary, this is in Unit 1, so if there are still words that students don't know, to bring those up. If they don't bring any up, then you might have them go through and read and interpret the sentences that use these particular words in them. Volatile, intractable, imminent, redress, those words that are important to the meaning of the particular sentences in Tyndall and Shai. Now, if you notice in their reading and annotating, because they're doing this in class, that students are really struggling with vocabulary, that it's not just a matter of figuring out a few words or just having a couple of words left over when they're done reading. they're really struggling, then maybe that's the first thing you want to discuss, even before you get to the open discussion and the questions. You need to be the judge of that to tell whether students are going to need that help, that extra help or not. So depending upon how they're doing in vocabulary, how they're thinking about it, you might want to put that part of your lesson up front before the discussion so you get those words out of the way. And then maybe give students a little more time to discuss the meaning of the text now that they know the vocabulary words. So after they've talked through that information, they're going to go back to their Cornell notes from the previous lesson. Remember, they took Cornell notes on the PowerPoint lecture. And there is information about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs fiasco in that PowerPoint. So what they're going to be doing is they're going to look for that information and in their notes, and opposite that information in their notes, they're going to be adding any new information that they might have discovered through reading. If there is contradictory information, in other words, the lecturer said one thing and then the Tyndall and Shai chapter said another, they should note that. If it says the same thing, the exact same thing, then they don't really have to add it because it's said in one place or the other, but they need to be paying attention to the shades of meaning. Now that's important. It's important because when students are going to be taking tests in their history class in college, they will have to integrate lecture and reading. That's part of what makes a student successful, is being able to do that. At the end of the Cornell notes, they write a summary, and so they could write the summary of the information at the bottom of each page, and your summary should include only the major points. This is another thing you might have to help them with. So and you might just have them write the summary about the information that they integrated, which was the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, the exercise in adding the notes is an exercise in synthesis, and then in writing the summary, that's another exercise in synthesis, something they will have to do if they read multiple texts or listen to a lecture and read in their college coursework. It also helps students to see how two texts can differ in an interpretation of events. The final thing they're going to be doing is use a pattern organizer. What a pattern organizer is it places the information in a graphic so that you can see causes and effects. And this pattern organizer is on page 59. There is a place to put in the time, place, duration. There's a place to put in the causes and the effects. The events that took place, and all the people that were involved in it. This is just another way to get at synthesis of the material. And it's also a good tool for identifying multiple causes and effects. You might want them to, as an added activity, have students label the causes and effects using G-Sprite. In other words, was it a political cause, an economic cause? What kind of effect was it? And that is the end of the lesson. This is a kind of a complicated lesson. It might take some time, especially if your students are struggling at all. So make sure that you have thoroughly read the teacher's guide, you understand it, and you can help students through some of those rough spots.